Hello everybody, and welcome back to another Know Your Ship episode. And today's episode is going to be on the Shiratsuyu class destroyer. Now there were 10 of these destroyers in total, and some of these names might seem a little bit familiar, but hopefully we'll be able to tell the story of the class, or at least the more famous ships. Okay, so the 10 ships of the class were the Shiratsuyu, the Shigure, the Murasame, the Yudachi, Harusame, Samidare, Umikaze, Yamakaze, Kawakaze, and Suzukaze. Now, the Shiratsuyu were actually modified Hatsuharu class destroyers. So there was something called the First Naval Armament Supplement Program. This was back in 1930, and they'd ordered a bunch of destroyers, initially all Hatsuharus, and then they found that the Hatsuharus suffered from stability issues because the Japanese really liked to cram every bit of equipment humanly possible onto a hull that wasn't really suited for cramming that much stuff into. Now the irony, of course, is that the Hatsuharus were actually an improvement on the Fubuki class because the Fubukis were not very stable. So the Hatsuharu tried to improve on the Fubuki class, they made the ship, and she still wasn't very stable. So yeah, they obviously had to redesign a couple of things and still wasn't all that satisfactory. So came up with another modified design, which became the Shiratsuyu class destroyers. And the Shiratsuyu class was different because it now had a much more compact bridge, which made the ship more stable because it was just less top weight. Now, technically speaking, the Shiratsuyu class were actually smaller destroyers compared to the Fubuki class. They were only around 1,700 metric tons, 103.5 meters long. They had a 9.9 meter beam and a 3.5 meter draft. They carried 527mm 50 caliber guns, and they had 2 dual turrets and 1 single turret. Now these were the Type B turrets, which means they were capable of limited anti-aircraft engagements. They fired high explosive, incendiary shrapnel, illumination rounds, and ASW rounds. For the high explosive shells, the guns were capable of throwing the shells to a max range of just under 18.5 kilometers, but the chances of shells actually going that far and actually hitting something very, very low, as the Japanese destroyers did not have any sort of radar-directed fire control. So generally speaking, engagement ranges with guns tended to be a lot closer. The guns were capable of firing between 5 to 10 rounds a minute, which is alright, but when you compare it to the guns packed on US destroyers, the rate of fire was a little bit on the slow side. Of course, the main weapons for Japanese destroyers were the torpedoes, and the Shiratsuyu class carried a good number of them. She carried 2 quad torpedo launchers, and these were the first Japanese destroyers to actually carry quad launchers. 610mm Type 93 torpedoes were the ammo, and of course these were the famous long lance torpedoes. Now these torpedoes were of course famous for the fact that they had a huge amount of range, generally packed quite a punch, and of course when they were fired they were pretty stealthy because they didn't leave that telltale wake. So they carried a total of 16 of these torpedoes, 8 in the launchers, 8 reloads, and it takes about 10 minutes to reload the launchers. These ships did have some limited anti-aircraft weaponry, some 25mm cannons, some 13mm machine guns, but overall was generally quite lacking, and later on during refits, what they would do is they would remove one of the turrets and they would replace that one turret with additional AA guns as aircraft became more and more deadly, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the story. And you'll see that aircraft did play quite a huge role, sort of reshaping how warfare was done. The ships did carry some depth charges, 16 of them in peacetime, 30-something during the war, but the Japanese Navy as a whole wasn't as good in the anti-submarine warfare department, especially when you compare it to other countries who are much more focused on the task. The ships also didn't initially come equipped with radar. By the time radar was finally installed, it was a little bit sort of too little too late kind of thing, as by that time American superiority when it came to radars was just leaps and bounds ahead of that of the Japanese Navy. Propulsion wise, the ships had 3 boilers which powered 2 turbines, giving the ships a maximum of 42,000 shaft horsepower, and they could propel the ships to a maximum of 34 knots. Although as the engines wore down, speed would decrease quite a bit, as you'll find out a little bit later on in the show. Most famous ship of the class is, of course, Shigure. How many of you said Yudachi? If you said Yudachi, way too much poi for you and just too much kankale. No, actually, If you said Shigure, then you're a naval history buff, as she is actually the most famous ship in the class. Now, to cover the entire operational history of all 10 ships would be a little bit outside the scope of this particular show, as, well, I mean, that would be a lot of stuff to talk about, and trying to cover every little escort mission would just be a little bit, it might be excessive. So what I'm going to do is I'm focusing probably on certain ships and certain operations. Yes, and we're going to start with Yudachi. I know, it's not a cancel thing. I'm just going to start with her because, well, she sort of participated in actions kind of early, was sort of significant, and, well, she ties into the rest of the story pretty well. Okay, so Yudachi took part in a number of different operations, engaging Allied destroyers and cruisers at the Battle of the Java Sea. She was part of the Midway operations, not really doing much because Midway was mostly a carrier battle, but I mean, she sort of was around for that. She was there at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, and she definitely, during the Guadalcanal campaign, engaged in a number of Tokyo Express runs. During one of these runs, she actually managed to participate in the sinking of 2 fast destroyer transports, the USS Gregory and USS Little. But the Yudachi's most well-known action was the first naval battle of Guadalcanal. 4 ships of the Shiratsuyu class were actually involved: Samedare, Murasame, Harusame, and Yudachi. Also involved was the destroyer of the Kagero class, Amatsukaze. Now, I know I'm not supposed to be really talking about that ship, but that ship was captained by someone who would soon become quite important to at least one of the ships in this class. But I'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so back to the battle. The first battle of Guadalcanal was basically one giant clusterfuck. Wait, can I say that? Yeah, I can say that, right? It was just basically one giant close-range brawl by a bunch of surface ships with the lights shot out. Everybody was just sort of fighting in the dark, and just stuff was happening, exploding all over the place. All right, but how did it get to that stage, right? Because that's the important question. Well, the Japanese fleet consisted of 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, 11 destroyers, and they were led by Admiral Koki Abe on board the battleship Hiei. Now, Admiral Abe was a destroyer specialist, and not only that, but he was also extremely well known for being very, very cautious, bordering on being timid at times, which is not always a trait you would want in an admiral. Anyways, okay, so as they were heading towards Guadalcanal to bombard the airfield there, and here's another issue that came up quite often, at least with the Japanese high command, is that they would run an operation, be successful once, and then be like, oh, we could totally do that again. As if the enemy's gonna let us do the exact same thing twice, right? And so that's sort of what high command ordered them to do, which is, hey, look, the previous time we had 2 battleships go in there and bombard this airfield, you guys are gonna do the exact same thing again, and hope America's Navy didn't notice that you're doing it. Right. You figure this is not a good thing, right? Anyways, on that day, as the fleet was going, they were spotted by a B-17, which means you have lost your element of surprise, and of course the enemy is going to be ready for you. So at 13:30 on the 12th of November, the Admiral ordered his fleet into a tight double half-ring formation. That sound complicated to you? Let me repeat that. It's a tight double half-ring formation. And if you thought that was complicated, trust me, it's a complex formation. And the reason why he chose this formation was it's good for dealing with potential surprise attacks by aircraft or submarine. Unfortunately, this is not really that great for surface action. Yeah, and you'll see how this gets a little bit later on. Now, this formation was heading towards Guadalcanal, and, quite sort of out of the blue, a very, very severe tropical rainstorm appeared. Now, a rainstorm can be good and bad. In this particular case, it initially was a good thing because it shrouded this entire fleet in darkness. To this admiral, the storm was great. I mean, here he was able to head towards the thing that he was going to bombard, and nobody was going to be able to see him. Like, that's fantastic. Now, to make things even better, the storm was actually moving at exactly the same heading and roughly the same speed as the ships of the fleet. Unfortunately, storms have one thing going for them, is that while they prevent other people from seeing you, they also kind of prevent your own ships from seeing each other. So, yeah, I mean, complex formations, going through a storm, can't see each other, not really all that great trying to maintain the shape of the formation, which of course meant that when the admiral finally got to where he wanted to be and he came out of the storm and was trying to get himself all ready to bombard the island, well, his fleet wasn't exactly in the shape that he thought they were, and this was going to add to quite a bit of confusion. Now, on the US side, they had all the initial advantages. They had the advantage of early intelligence reports from the bombers. They also had the advantage of having radar, and of course, you'd figure having all that advantage would allow you to make sure that you'd set a trap or you did things right. Well, things didn't really go all their way either. They started off right. I mean, Admiral Callahan brought in his 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers in a single column formation, which is very, very nice because, at one order, the entire fleet could have made one turn and they would have been able to cross the T of the Japanese fleet, which would have allowed them to bring all their guns to bear. Huge, huge advantage for the US side. So you'd figure that that's what would have happened, but unfortunately, things didn't really go that way for either side, actually. So on the Japanese side, here was an admiral that wasn't really sure where everything was, and on the US side, they started right, but confusion was about to reign supreme. Alright, so the 2 fleets getting closer to each other. The US fleet, obviously, with their radar, able to strike the Japanese fleet first. Admiral got a bit of information here, got a bit of information there, tried to issue order here, tried to issue orders there, and none of the movement really happened. And so what ended up happening was they sort of just ran into each other. So if you look at this picture, which shows the starting position of the 2 sides, here's the picture of them as the engagement started, and you'll sort of just see the US fleet just kind of ran right into the Japanese fleet, like head on, straight in. And of course, the minute that happens, it just went from potentially a well-organized fight into one giant brawl where somebody shot out all the lights and nobody can really see. Anyways, so Initially, okay, let's go back a little bit. Let's backtrack a little bit. So on the US side, they saw them, but they couldn't really get their stuff in order. While on the Japanese side, because they had no radar, they had absolutely no awareness that the US fleet was even there. So the admiral was like, well, seems like we're not running into any US ships tonight. Let's load up Type 3 ammunition so we can start bombarding the airfield. And then suddenly at 23:41 hours that night, the Yudachi, which was operating at the tip of the formation, reported sighting enemy ships. And of course, this led to absolute pandemonium on the Japanese ships, especially the battleships, as the crews, which had carted in all the Type 3 ammunition, was like, oh my god, we've got to replace all of this with armor-piercing ammo. And so, mass pandemonium there, trying to get the right ammo switched in. And the destroyers, too, were actually in disarray. See, in the Vanguard, where Yudachi was supposed to be, there was supposed to be a total of 5 destroyers, but because earlier on in the storm, coming out of the storm, there was a couple of movements and whatnot, and so more than half the Vanguard, 3 out of the 5 destroyers, ended up actually behind the battleship, so they were completely out of the fight at the beginning of this battle. So, things not looking up, too good right now for the Japanese side. Alright, so the other destroyer in the Vanguard, which was the Harusame, having now lost sight of the Yudachi, was like, well, okay, you can do your own thing. I'm going to go find the light cruiser Nagara in the fleet, and so kind of turned away as well. So Yudachi was pretty much by herself up in the front, running into the enemy fleet, which, yeah, you can figure out is not all that good. So eventually, as the 2 fleets were getting closer and closer together, the admiral on board Hieyu was like, you know what, I really need to figure out where things are. So he turned on his searchlights at 2350 to try to find Nagara. Now, he was thinking that the Nagara was only about 2,000 meters in front of him. He turned on his searchlights, and Nagara wasn't anywhere in sight. The Nagara was, in fact, another 5,000 meters away. So, definitely not in the position that the admiral thought his ships were in. Of course, his destroyers were, like I said, in the wrong place as well. And as he was looking around, his light fell on the very, very unlucky Atlanta. Now, the Atlanta, of course, having been lit up by the lights, immediately started return fire with her 127mm guns. All of them. Except they were aimed a little bit in a rush, and the shells fell quite a bit short. The battleship, of course, aimed her guns at the Atlanta, fired its salvo, and of course, that was not a very good day for the Atlanta as 8 14-inch shells hit the cruiser and she was definitely in trouble. And this is the beginning of pandemonium, right? So the fleets sort of meet each other, the Atlanta gets shot, every other thing in the fleet started to open up against each other. The the destroyers on the U.S. side started to focus fire the Hiei, which had lit up its lights and just basically turned itself into a giant Christmas tree in the dark. And of course, everybody started focusing on that giant pagoda-like structure. And of course, taking tons and tons of hits. The Admiral's chief of staff, I believe, was killed. The Admiral was wounded. So, sort of mass pandemonium there. Yudachi, sort of by herself and having initially turned away, saw the U.S. ships in a nice column coming in, decided to turn around and cut right in front of the column and managed to cut in front of a U.S. destroyer, the Aaron Ward. So, of course, while she was doing that, she was just pounding away at everything she could see. And you'd figure that, suddenly here's the Japanese destroyer that cut in front of your ships. Not really fun if you were sailing in a nice column thinking that nothing's going to jump in front of you. So, of course, this caused the Aaron Ward to violently try to maneuver in order to avoid a collision. And, of course, the ships behind the Aaron Ward had to take evasive action as well. So the USS Barton immediately tried to stop, actually managed to stop, and then because the Barton stopped, well, she ate 2 torpedoes fired by the Amatsukaze, which decided to take advantage of the chaos that was happening. The Barton would sink rapidly with pretty heavy loss of life. The Yudachi, after having cut across the column, heeled hard to the right, turned, and found itself parallel to the USS Juno. So she fired all of her torpedoes, but they all missed. And so then she started engaging in a gunfight against the USS Juno. And this is potentially a very one-sided fight because, generally speaking, destroyer versus cruiser at close range, just not really that great of an idea. But right as the Yudachi was about to get in quite a bit of trouble, another torpedo came in from the Amatsukaze, hit the Juno, disabled her, and then this of course would lead to the eventual heavy loss of life, including all 5 Sullivan brothers. That's, again, a story for another day. Anyways, so Yudachi, after escaping the Juno, then managed to close the range of the USS Portland, who was busy fighting a couple other ships at the time, managed to come in from basically her blind spot, fired another batch of torpedoes, which managed to hit the Portland. Now, not long after that, the Yudachi was caught by 2 U.S. destroyers, which managed to hit her, and the hit was not a very, very lucky hit for Yudachi. Hit her in the boiler room, and she came to a complete halt. So, not good at all. Samidare and Murasame, which had initially fallen behind the fleet, they entered the battle really, really late, and they would both assist in the sinking of the destroyer USS Monson, and they would damage the cruiser USS Helena. After 40 minutes of pretty much point-blank range brawling, the 2 sides finally disengaged. Samidare, after the disengage, would go ahead and rescue 207 survivors from the Yudachi and then attempt to scuttle her with a torpedo. Unfortunately, that didn't work, and the Yudachi stayed afloat, and her abandoned hulk was finally sunk later by shells from the USS Portland, who was still happily sailing around in circles after having her rudder jammed by a torpedo hit. So, this particular battle was, you could say, a tactical Japanese win. At the time that the battle finished, they still had combat-effective ships. The U.S., at the end of this engagement, had 1 light cruiser and 1 destroyer that was still effective at putting up some degree of resistance. But fortunately for the U.S., the Japanese didn't really press their advantage, maybe because the Admiral was a cautious man and maybe a bit of a coward, but anyways. So the Japanese won a tactical victory, but the US, we could comfortably say, won the strategic victory in this battle, as the Japanese was not able to go ahead and shell the island, and in particular the airfield. And now, of course, our story begins to shift from the Yudachi to a more specific captain and a very specific ship. Now, during the first Battle of Guadalcanal, Captain Hara was in command of the Amatsukaze. However, she was pretty brutalized by the USS Helena, suffering 43 dead and spent quite a long period of time in dry dock. So Captain Hara, who went on leave after returning to Japan and waiting for his ship to get fixed, was eventually given command of Destroyer Division 27, and his flagship was to be the Shigure. Now, I'm only going to tell you some of the little sort of bits of this story because I can't really tell the entire thing. If you want the full story, you can go check out Captain Hara's book called Japanese Destroyer Captain. It's an excellent, 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 excellent book. Wow. How many excellents did I put in there? I think 5. Okay, here's another one. It's an excellent book, really. And I really, really, really recommend that you go and find a copy of this book and read it. I mean, it's a great book. I mean, here's a Japanese destroyer captain who gave a very, very fair analysis of the actions of both the Japanese Navy and the U.S. Navy. Now, lots of first-hand accounts of the action, the meetings behind closed doors, and all these kinds of things, and really provide a very, very good insight into the Japanese Navy of World War II. And it's quite a bit different than what you would normally have come to believe, I guess, if you've watched a lot of documentaries and things like that. I mean, the Japanese Navy, if you believe Captain Hara's account, did a lot of things really, really badly. So anyways, Captain Hara's first impression of his new command, the Shigure, was definitely not a good one. I mean, here he was given a pretty rundown ship after having been given a pretty good, modern ship ahead of time. This was a pretty rundown ship. Could do no better than 33 knots, and in most cases could only do about 30, with a crew that he described as a bunch of ill-disciplined landlubbers. So he had his work cut out for him. He immediately set out to, sort of get this crew ready for battle. And of course, with his battle experience, he knew what it took. And it was tough with a crew that weren't very well disciplined. So Captain Hara and the Shigure eventually made it to Truk. And the admiral in charge there said to Captain Hara, you know what, your crew probably needs a little bit of time. How about you take 3 months and you can work the crew into fighting shape? However, by 1943, things were starting to change quite drastically. As Captain Hara was reading through the intelligence and action reports, he started to gain this understanding of this growing technological superiority that the US had over the Japanese. During one encounter, 2 Japanese destroyers were sunk before they could even shoot back at the US ships because radar-directed gunfire. U.S. tactics was also beginning to evolve, having found that high-altitude bombing to be pretty much ineffective. The U.S. started switching to low-altitude bombing, and in one particular case, a new type of bombing called skip bombing was tried out. And in that one particular battle, cost the Japanese 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers. So facing these new challenges, Captain Hara drilled his crew every day for a solid 4 months to try to get them ready for action. And he was tough. I mean, I think it was one time after like 40 days of hard drills, he was asked if it was okay for the crew to maybe go check out a movie. And he was like, nope. He was one tough guy, and he demanded that degree of excellence from his crew. But they would soon come to realize how valuable, getting them into tip-top shape was going to be. So finally, after 4 months, the Shigure was ready for action, and the first thing that command ordered the Shigure to do was to join up with Destroyer Division 4 and do a transport mission through the Vela Gulf, which was used successfully 10 days earlier by another ship. Now, Captain Hara at this time thought, this is maybe not a good idea to do the exact same thing twice, but headquarters overruled him and sent the Shigure and 3 other destroyers on their way. Luckily, this time the mission sort of went out without a hitch, and on the way out, the lead destroyer in the group actually rammed PT-109, John F. Kennedy's PT boats. Anyways, all 4 destroyers returned to base safe and sound, so that mission went out without a hitch. Well, 2 days later, High Command thought, hey, that last mission worked pretty well. Let's send you guys and do the exact same mission again. Now, Captain Hara this time actually voiced his objections about running the exact same mission 3 times in a row. But, of course, High Command was like, yeah, nope, you're just a lowly destroyer captain, be quiet and listen to us. And so, of course, no choice, he went on this 3rd mission. And at this 3rd mission, things went horribly wrong during what became finally known as the Battle of the Vela Gulf. On August the 6th of 1943, 6 U.S. destroyers of Task Force 31.2 under the command of Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, hope I got that name correctly, ambushed the Japanese destroyer. And Captain Hara, who was very wary of this repeat mission and was a little bit more cautious and alert for possible enemy ships, was the only one who noticed a torpedo attack by the U.S. destroyers, and was the only one who managed to take any action, saving his crew, the soldiers he was transporting, and the ship. And even he still needed some luck. There was a torpedo that approached him, hit the rudder, but it turned out to be a dud. So in one very, very fast engagement with the other ships not even realizing what was happening, they lost 3 destroyers just like that. The US had used their intelligence and superior radar technology to great use, and the Japanese paid heavily for the loss of these 3 ships. Out of the 1,520 sailors and soldiers on the 3 Japanese destroyers, only 310 of them would survive. So after this Vela Gulf debacle, the crew on board the Shigure, they changed dramatically. Initially, they were still sort of unhappy at the captain for having done what he'd done, but now they realized that the captain's harshness during training and his demand for constant excellence had actually saved their lives. So they immediately had a tremendous amount of respect for him, and the ship became a very, very tight-knit crew. The next operation started on the 17th of August, with Shigure joining 3 other destroyers in an operation led by Admiral Ijuin in the destroyer Sazanami, and they joined up with 20 small landing barges to bring reinforcement to a place called Horeinu. That evening, the 4 Japanese destroyers ran into 4 US destroyers, and they engaged in a bit of a running duel. Quite a lot of shells were fired at each other, torpedoes were launched at each other, but no major hits were recorded. Eventually, both sides withdrew, with 2 Japanese destroyers suffering some minor damage, while the US destroyers got off without a scratch. While the naval battle itself could be called a bit of a draw, the Japanese did win a bit of a strategic victory, being able to land 400 reinforcements onto Horeinu. So, once again, the Shigure returned without suffering any damage and no injuries to the crew. And this was pretty much an incredible thing, because Japanese destroyers rarely managed to get through 2 operations in a row without some kind of loss. And so Shigure's reputation and that of her captain started to grow. Shigure would go through another mission, once again without a scratch, and start to earn the nickname as the Indestructible Destroyer. On the 1st of September, the Shigure would sortie by herself to make a solo transport run to Tuvalu. This was incredibly dangerous, as Tuvalu was easily within range of Allied air patrols, and if a ship were to be spotted, it would be attacked. The Shigure would actually be attacked because they actually got spotted. And they were actually caught off guard as well by surprise dive bombing attacks. So enemy bombs were starting to land all around the ship. One of them landed really close, like 10 meters away. And Captain Hara ordered that the destroyer should immediately go to flank speed and overboost immediately. Now, this was a bit of a strange command, as most captains would have to take the ship to flank speed first before overboosting, and it would take 15 minutes to do that. So he was like, yes, we're going to go to flank speed and we're going to overboost immediately. Now, this immediately led to something very strange happening, because as soon as the overboost was hit, fuel oil started to get burned in the funnel. So now flames are coming out of the funnel, and of course their ship became this giant target for everything, right? Like, I mean, this is an easy target to hit. Well, to the pilots of the attacking aircraft, it actually created a different kind of illusion. They actually thought that they had hit the ship. And so the pilots on non-secure radio actually radioed back to base and said that they had hit a destroyer directly amidships and that she was now on fire and sinking. So they didn't send any more planes out against the Shigure, and the Shigure actually managed to complete her mission and managed to then return back to base without any damage taken, without any loss to his crew. And of course, now he earned the nickname as the Miracle Captain for having come up with such an unconventional tactic to get his ship out of danger. Now, to get a sense of how quickly the war was changing, by the 6th of October, only a month and a half after the landing of those 400 reinforcements on Horeinu, they now had to go back to the same place, and they had to evacuate the troops and move them to a different location. So again, Admiral Ijuin would once again lead this operation. This time he would bring 6 modern combat-ready destroyers, including Captain Hara's Shigure, to protect 3 elderly destroyer transports. At about 10:30 that evening, they ran into a U.S. destroyer force consisting of the Selfridge, the Chevalier, and the O'Bannon, the one of potato throwing fame. So the destroyers, led by Captain Walker, engaged immediately. Absolutely no hesitation there on the U.S. side, and with the assistance of radar-directed fire control, they were able to hit the Yugumo really early on. Now, the Yugumo also took a further torpedo, which pretty much led to her sinking, but the Yugumo did manage to actually get off her torpedoes. Now, the U.S. destroyers actually would have been fine if they had just actually kept going on the same course, but In, I guess, a rush to engage the other Japanese destroyers, they turned in order to engage with more guns. And by doing so, they actually put themselves right in front of the torpedoes, and one of them from the Yugumo hit the Chevalier, and of course her magazine detonated. She didn't immediately sink, but she was definitely crippled. Now, she did execute a last-second attempt to get out of the way, but that only threw her right in front of the O'Bannon, who then rammed into her, and then the two ships kind of got stuck on each other. Right, so now there is only one remaining U.S. destroyer, and that would be the Selfridge. And the Selfridge managed to avoid the carnage, get out, and start engaging the Japanese destroyers. The Shigure and the Samidare, at this point, would start exchanging gunfire with the Selfridge and also fired some torpedoes at her. At 11:06 in the evening, a torpedo from either the Shigure or the Samidare hit the Selfridge in the bow, disabling her. The remaining Japanese destroyers, however, disengaged from the actions, believing, from an erroneous report from a scout plane, that there was a further squadron of U.S. cruisers that were now closing in. So, immediately decided that, hey, destroyers versus cruisers, probably not a good fight, so they broke off the action. The evacuation mission was a huge success. The U.S. had actually lost one destroyer and had two heavily damaged, in exchange for a single Japanese destroyer sunk. This, according to Captain Hara, was the first Japanese naval victory in the theater in 3 whole months, which just shows that in fact, it's a really, really small action was considered like this huge kind of victory, which really sort of just underlines how badly the war was going for Japan. So, finally, they get back to base, and, there was a lot of discontent among the destroyer captains, at least, at the high command, who they thought was just holding back all the heavy units of the Japanese Navy, so the destroyers were basically doing all the fighting and the transporting, and of course the dying. Now, Shigure would once again be in another major action at the Battle of the Empress Auguste Bay. This is around the start of November 1943. The Japanese sort of took a bunch of ships, threw them together into a naval squadron under the command of Admiral Sentaro Omori to contest the landings on the 1st of November by the U.S. 3rd Marine Division on Cape Torokina. Omori was an admiral, yes, so he had the rank, but who was until very recently doing nothing more than instructing in tactics at torpedo school and had not seen a major naval battle, which just sort of goes to show that it's like high command of the Imperial Japanese Navy seemed to really like making very boneheaded decisions at times, like, hey, we have an admiral who hasn't seen any fighting, let's send him in there and see how he does, instead of, maybe promoting one of your battle-hardened captains to an admiral position to have them do it. I don't know. That's just what I think. Anyways, so they assigned this admiral, gave him a couple of heavy cruisers, the Miyoko and the Haguro, gave him a couple of light cruisers, the Sendai and the Agano, and 6 destroyers, including the Shigure. The Sendai was once again under the command of Admiral Ijuin, and this battle did not go well for the Japanese at all. The Americans had them scouted early, laid in wait. When radar contact was established, the starting engagement went very much in the U.S.'s favor. Sendai was actually nailed by radar-directed first salvo from a cruiser, something which Captain Hara actually remarked as just being quite extraordinary. Like, holy crap, this ship, while maneuvering, got hit by a salvo, which it just stunned him. So while the Sendai was being pounded to death, a signal was sent to the Shigure, asking the Shigure to come alongside and help with the rescue. Captain Hara, realizing this was absolutely impossible due to the amount of concentrated fire being directed at the Sendai, refused the order and broke off. The two sides exchanged torpedoes, but things were generally turning to chaos on the Japanese side. Samidare would collide with Shiratsuyu, and both were forced to retire from the battle. Miyoko actually rammed into Hatsukaze, slicing off the destroyer's bow, then was hit by another bunch of 6-inch shells, which knocked out her torpedoes. The Japanese had some surface search radar, but it wasn't capable of directing gunfire yet, so they really had to rely on optics and flares, which just wasn't all that good when you compare it to radar-directed fire. And every time the Japanese did start to actually manage to get better, more accurate fire on the American ships would deploy smoke, throw off the Japanese gunners, and continue firing. One U.S. destroyer was heavily damaged during this action. However, a lack of radar getting hit and just that earlier erroneous report about enemy ship numbers convinced the Japanese admiral in charge that now he was fighting a massively superior force, and at 0337, just over an hour after the fighting started, he ordered his ships to withdraw. Total Japanese losses in this battle numbered 1 light cruiser sunk, 1 destroyer sunk, 1 heavy cruiser damaged, 1 light cruiser damaged, and 2 destroyers heavily damaged. The early Japanese advantages of night fighting no longer really existed due to superior radar technology that was possessed by the US. There were going to be a few more other small actions by the Shigure, with Captain Hara in charge. One of them was finding a counter to skip bombing, which he actually figured out while he was under attack by US bombers. Because what was happening was that every single time the US would try skip bombing, the Japanese ships would conduct a series of standard evasive maneuvers. Now, what Hara was thinking about is, hang on a minute, if every time we do this and the US has figured out this is our standard evasive pattern, they're probably calculating our evasive maneuver into their bombing run. So instead of doing any evasive maneuver, why don't we just sail in a straight line and see what happens? And he did exactly just that, and of course the bomb hit the water, skipped, and went right over the ship. Didn't hit them. So he actually figured out how to deal with that while he was actually under attack. Quite a guy, actually. Anyways, the Shigure finally returned to Japan in mid-November for repairs. In the 8 months that the destroyer was involved in combat with Captain Hara in command, she lost no crew, and she suffered no other combat damage except for a little bit of damage to her rudder caused by that dud torpedo. And of course, this made her quite a bit of a legend. Local newspapers wrote front-page articles about the indestructible destroyer and her miracle captain, and they became one of the most famous warships in the Japanese Navy. Unfortunately for the Shigure, Captain Hara will be transferred in December to be an instructor of guess what? A torpedo school. Yep, I mean, Japanese high command, I mean, it's like, hey, look, we have a captain who's doing really, really well. Let's move him to an instructor school. At a time when the Japanese Navy really needed captains like him on the front line. Shigure's service, after Captain Hara departed, would not be so charmed. During an air raid on truck by U.S. Navy aircraft, her number 2 turret would be hit, killing 21 and wounding 45. Another engagement against U.S. destroyers and cruisers, she would take 2 shell hits, killing 7 and wounding 15. At the Battle of the Surigao Strait, she took a direct hit and several misses, losing her radio, steering, and compass, but was the only ship of the Southern Force to survive that bloody battle, so I guess she was still a little bit lucky there. But her luck would finally run out, completely. On the 24th of January 1945, while on escort duty, she was torpedoed by the USS Blackfin, 37 sailors being lost on that occasion. All 10 ships of this class would be lost during the Second World War. Shiratsuyu's luck seemed to be mostly crap. She was involved in collisions twice, and the second time that she was involved in a collision with Amaru, it actually ended up sinking her. Most ships of the class were actually lost to submarines, including the Shigure, although 3 were lost in surface actions. That would be the Kawakaze, the Yudachi, and the Murasame. Those would be lost in surface actions. Harusame would be the only one lost to an air attack. All in all, these ships provided very, very valuable service to the nation, although they were often terribly let down by the people in the upper command. And that does it for this episode, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I mean, it was a lot of fun looking up all the information for this particular ship, and it was really, really nice to actually have a book with first-hand account of the ship in action from one of her captains. And I do really recommend, even though I'm sounding like an old record right now, that you go and find that book and actually read it. It's a fantastic book. Anyways, I do, of course, also want to thank my patrons for their support. Without you guys, these kinds of episodes would not be possible, and it's only with your support that I'm able to take a number of days without producing anything to make one long episode like this. Anyways, folks, thank you all for watching. Take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.